minutes you can sit back and relax as we take a time portal back to the early days of your state. Now, of course, if you believe the rest of the country, Minnesota is weird in its own right. Because if you believe the rest of the country, everyone in Minnesota lives in the Twin Cities. Everyone's a crazy Vikings fan. Fargo is actually in Minnesota. Everyone has a cabin up north and everyone's very nice. And even though this last one may be true, I'm going to be talking about a different side of Minnesota. One far more interesting, more bizarre than you could ever imagine. So what exactly are we going to talk about this evening? Well, we're going to talk about everything from bizarre deaths and ghosts all the way down to some peculiar people and UFOs. I've also thrown in what I call keep in mind, just things about the state you might not be familiar with. For instance, in the era in which we're operating tonight, there were only about 430,000 people in your state. Today you have around 6 million people here, which means back then they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird. And believe me, they took full advantage of that space. So first off, bizarre deaths. Today, if you open up your newspaper and flip to the obituary section, you'll probably see something similar to this. Old Man Lewis died peacefully surrounded by his loving family. No details, no cause of death, no information whatsoever. But I found in the era in which I was digging up stuff from the 1800s, early 1900s, the obituaries were a little bit different. Because I was finding obituaries like this. Suicide is gruesome. Whole top of, well, you get the point here. You can see they put too much information, too much of the cause of death, too many details. This is quite a bit different than dying peacefully surrounded by your loving family. So it got me really interested in how we viewed death in the old days. In the old days, death was a bit of a mystery. Anything could cause your death, which is why you often got strange stories with headlines like this. Man kills himself because he's homely. Out of Albert Lee. He went to the theater at the time. He saw a young girl there that he was courting. She was with another suitor. So he took a gun, put it to his heart for good effect, pulled the trigger, and died because he simply believed that he was not good enough for this young woman. But when you hear of people dying like this at a young age, you don't have to feel too bad for them because back in 1900, the average life expectancy in America was only 47 years of age. Mainly this was due to infant mortality and farm accidents and the like. But in the old days, anything could get you. Today, everybody loves to get scared, at least in a controlled environment, like going to a scary movie or an amusement park. But in the old days, being afraid could cost you your life, which is exactly what happened to this gentleman who dropped dead from fright. He was a postmaster, and his accounting came up a bit short, and rather than explain the difference, he took a different way out and dropped dead from fright. I have hundreds of stories of people dying from fright, from runaway horses scaring them, to lightning storms scaring them, even getting a phone call about a death of a relative caused one man to drop dead. So oftentimes being scared caused you to die. But there was something these people believed in and were fearful of more than death. In fact, more than the threat of dying was the belief that you were going to be buried alive, that you wouldn't be dead, but they would bury you 6 feet under. And it's a great piece of urban legend, great piece of folklore, but was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, they would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem silly for us today with modern science and medicine to be afraid of this, but our grandparents, they were so terrified they came up with several inventions. One of which is this, one of my favorites. It's called a cemetery bell. And it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell that you could have above your grave with a rope on a pole. The laser pointer doesn't work on the screen, but a rope on a pole going into your casket. So if you awoke in time, all you'd have to do is tug that rope, it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived there at the time that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. There was one problem with this invention though. On many nights the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare thinking everybody had been buried alive. In fact, after your loved one died in the old days, it was your responsibility to sit around their grave for several nights, making sure that they were truly dead, that they wouldn't rise up. As you can see evidenced by this photograph, in the old days, cemeteries were more multifunctional than they are today. You'd go there to have a family reunion, a picnic. You could camp and sleep at the graveyard if you wanted. Where today, most of our graveyards are nothing more than memorials for our deceased. But I'm going to stop talking about death. Not because I don't find it fascinating, I do, but because it's dangerous. I dug up dozens and dozens of cases where people were talking about death when they dropped dead on the spot, as though all you have to do is mention the Grim Reaper and the Grim Reaper will come looking for you. So I'm going to move on to our next topic while I still can, and that is ghosts and haunted locations. Today in Minnesota, you can't throw a rock without hitting a place that has a haunted reputation tied to it. The same could be said 100 years ago, maybe even more so. Right down the road in Mankato is one of my favorite legends of the old Calvary Cemetery, the old crypt of Dr. Fallman. This was the first crypt or mausoleum that was constructed with private funds in Mankato. And by all counts, he was a great, upstanding citizen of Mankato, died of old age, natural causes, lived a great life helping people. So why his mausoleum took on a haunted reputation right away, I don't know. But people would go out there, mostly teenagers and college-age kids, would go out believing that the crypt was haunted, that you could go out there and hear disembodied voices talking to you. You'd see weird balls of light moving around. Eventually, so many people went there that a dare started springing up about the mausoleum. And the dare was this, that if you're brave enough or foolish enough to knock on the front doors of the mausoleum, it would act as some sort of supernatural doorbell. And not only would you hear mysterious knocking coming from inside the locked mausoleum, but many claim the doctor would show up in demon form or monster form and chase you out of the cemetery. On any given night, you can go there and see UW or University of Mankato students around waiting for that demon doctor to show up. You can go there during the day in the safety of the daylight if you choose, and hopefully the doctor will be in for you as well. But if you're looking to go to one haunted place in Minnesota with a long and storied history, I highly recommend you head down south to Loon Lake, to a place called Loon Lake Cemetery. Actually, I recommend you don't go to this one, because the locals, they don't call it Loon Lake Cemetery. They call this place Witch Cemetery. Legend is, many years ago in the 1800s, a young girl by the name of Mary Jane was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. So the community got together to stop her from bringing evil to their village. How they did that was they grabbed an axe, took it to her, and ended her life. They buried her and the bloody axe out at a grave at Loon Lake. If there's any cemetery that looks like it should be haunted, it's this one. It's in the middle of absolutely nowhere. You have to walk about a quarter mile on this makeshift trail until you get to the graveyard. And then you find it's completely abandoned, neglected, and heavily vandalized. People have all sorts of paranormal activity happen to them out there. But the favorite story of mine is the legend that if you go out there and jump over, walk over, or merely touch the grave of that witch, she will come out and curse you with bad luck until the day you die. Every year I'd hear from a handful of people who claim that when they jumped over the grave of the witch, they lost their employment, they broke up with their significant other, they had a minor car accident, even death of somebody there. In fact, I collected so many versions of this legend that when I first went there 20 plus years ago, I was excited to take the dare for myself. The problem is, though, we don't know which grave is the witch's. Half the graves in the cemetery are unmarked. No one knows who's buried where. Even the old plat books are in disarray. In fact, Mary Jane, the alleged witch, well, her gravestone is down at the Historical Society's museum. They have it there on display because they were afraid somebody was going to steal it. Local legend actually tells there may be 3 different witches out at the cemetery. But because we don't know where they're buried, my advice is when you go there, just avoid every gravestone you can, thereby decreasing your chances that the witch will curse you with bad luck as well. But of course, not everyone believes there's a witch out here, which is exactly why this is the first thing you'll see when you get there. A sign telling you there are no witches or ghosts that exist in the cemetery. But you don't have to take their word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take your own word for it. Because right in front of the entrance to the graveyard is a small self-registering campground where you can spend the night all by yourself. It is so secluded, nobody will bother you while you're there. At least not anyone who's alive, that is. But there are other scary things in Minnesota besides ghosts. And for one of them, just keep in mind that you can head to Austin and see it. It's the home of spam. You can go to their newish museum. It's a fantastic museum in Austin, and go there and find out what the heck spam actually is. I love this category because today we could probably explain some of these mysteries with our science, but back then they had no idea what was going on. Now, just in the audience, I'm curious, do any of you drink coffee? You like coffee? A few of you? I'm from Wisconsin, we don't have coffee, but I know a lot of you here in Minnesota do like your coffee, but, so I don't know, is 20 quarts of coffee a lot a day? Because that's what this woman did, and it was said to have made her go insane from drinking 20 quarts a day. So they brought her to Rochester, put her in the insane asylum, and said, we will cure her by just simply taking coffee away from her. They thought they would have a cold turkey, she'd be cured and out within a month or so. Well, it actually made her worse. She ended up spending the rest of her life in the insane asylum, all because of drinking too much coffee. Now Wisconsin doesn't look so foolish, I guess, that we're just beer only. Keep in mind also Tonka trucks were invented and for the longest time manufactured here in Minnesota as well. In fact, Minnesota's so weird, other states tried to steal some of your weirdness. Like Illinois, those crazy folks down there trying to claim that this young woman was from Illinois. The Woolly Girl, as she was known. You can see she was called that because her face had fine, silky hair growing all over her face. But the problem was with all these Illinois newspapers claiming she was from there is that she wasn't. She was from Minnesota here. She ended up becoming a well-known freak of nature, performing with carnivals and circuses throughout the Midwest. And even if you don't believe the articles, she wasn't part woolly girl, she wasn't part goat or part sheep. She simply suffered from a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis. Back then, those afflicted with this ailment would often grow facial hair thick on their face and upper torso. Usually, these people would be put on display as freaks of nature at the local dime museum, where people would pay a nickel or a dime to go see them and gawk at them. If they were lucky, their parents would allow them to run off and live their life on the road. with the circus or carnival, with people like P.T. Barnum from the Barnum and Bailey Circus, and later Robert Ripley from Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And I said if they were lucky, their parents would allow them. And believe it or not, oftentimes their parents would allow them because the parents knew that the kid would have a much better life on the road and they'd make a lot more money doing it than they would back on the farm in Minnesota. In fact, at one time in history, both P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature, General Tom Thumb here, were two of the wealthiest men in America from displaying freaks of nature. But some freaks were not as easy to find, which brings us to one of my favorite categories, mysterious creatures. Creatures that science says do not exist, skeptics say they can't exist, but every year in Minnesota, people are coming face to face with these unknown creatures. One of my favorites is not too far from here. It's the old Mississippi River monster. Believe it or not, in the 1800s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River because they believed there were giant monsters living in the water that you needed to avoid at all costs. If you believe the newspaper accounts of that era, these things were 9 feet long, covered in a thick scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. Parents refused to allow their children to play down by the river because they truly believed there were man-eating fish in the river. What was happening is men mostly, probably drunk, were drowning in the river. And when they pulled their bodies out, they found a lot of them had deep scratch marks or claw marks on their calves and ankles, as though something grabbed them and pulled them out to their watery grave. But if you follow the Mississippi River a bit, eventually you'll hit Lake Pepin. It's a lake on the Mississippi River dividing Minnesota and Wisconsin. They believe something big is lurking in their waters as well. The stories go back to the first indigenous people of the area. It was said that they would only take their strongest and sturdiest canoes out on the water because every time they capsized or drowned, they blamed it on this hideous monster. When the steamboat captains came up, they too started reporting these giant leviathan of the deep out there. We have newspaper accounts going back to the Civil War talking about a monster being in Lake Pepin. Here's one saying it was somewhere between the size of a rhinoceros and an elephant. They thought it might even be a whale back then in Lake Pepin, which is not very deep. So many people saw it over the decades that they finally dubbed it Peppy, the lake monster of Lake Pepin. But don't let these cutesy postcards and t-shirts fool you. Many believe it's a deadly sea serpent. Not only have people seen it, some believe they've captured photographic evidence of it. A few years ago, a man was out fishing with his buddy. He told me they saw what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current of the water. They thought it was very odd, so they motored over there, and when they got there, he realized it wasn't a log at all. He snapped a photo of what he thinks shows a long-necked, hump-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. Now, I've been on numerous expeditions to Lake Pepin, most recently even spending many days and nights living on a houseboat with my colleague, noted researcher Noah Voss. As you can see, we had underwater cameras, we had sonar, we had fishing equipment, we had huge nets. We even jumped in using ourselves as bait, but thankfully or luckily, Peppy did not grab us while we were there. The legend goes back so long that noted author Laura Ingalls Wilder from the Little House on the Prairie fame said, "I was born in a log house within 4 miles of the legend-haunted Lake Pepin," talking about the monster of Lake Pepin. The best part of this story is the people of Lake City, Minnesota are so convinced Peppy is real, or at least convinced that you'll come looking for it, they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of this monster. As of today, nobody has collected the reward. It is supposed to be heating up this weekend. You could probably get to Lake City, capture Pepe, and be back $50,000 the richer. But maybe you want to wait till summer. Or maybe you want to battle legally to be known as the icebox of the nation. Believe it or not, there are numerous cities here in America that are all legally suing each other to be called the icebox of the nation. Even though most scholars believe that International Falls, Minnesota is the icebox of the nation. Unless, of course, our friends in Alaska want to get involved, and then it's not very fair. But for now, International Falls, icebox of the nation. So I brought up Pepe, a sea serpent. Some of you might have heard of it, or at least sea serpents in general. But this next legend of Minnesota, this creature, is one you've probably never heard of, because most people haven't, even though it's been around for over 100 years. And that is the dreaded creature of the Northwoods, a monster the people of the Lakes of the Wood area called the devil moose. Now, yes, from the early 1900s, late 1800s, the indigenous people talked about a humongous devil moose. It seemed to be something out of Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory, because not only was it gigantic, it seemed to be a hodgepodge of different animals. They would track it for a bit, but the tracks would switch from bear to elk, back to moose, and then something unknown. They thought it was a supernatural being. The indigenous people told the pioneers of the area, don't go looking for this thing. It's supernatural, it has powers. If anything happens to it, it will cause terrible illness and bad luck within our community. So of course the pioneers said, let's go hunt it, which they tried to do on several occasions. Hundreds of men gathered in a posse. They went out into the swampy wetlands of the Lakes of the Woods area, near the Crookston area and beyond. And thankfully, or maybe unfortunately, they never did find the devil moose. I like to think that it's still up there, waiting for unsuspecting tourists to make their way up to the Northwoods. Or what about this category? These stories were so bizarre, they didn't fit into any one category, so I made their own category for them. Keep in mind, here in Minnesota, you have more miles of bike trails than anywhere else in the entire country. A beautiful assortment of bike trails. I don't have to tell you people that. You have one right through here as well. Now, a lot of you probably watch some television, and recently, within the last decade or so, there was a show on TV called Wife Swap. People seemed to love it as families would switch wives or husbands or spouses, and hilarity would ensue. But a lot of people don't realize that some people in Minnesota took it a step too far, because this gentleman, well, he wasn't happy with his wife, so instead of divorcing her and moving on, well, maybe I better let you take a look. He married his wife's mother. Dead quiet, which is usually the response when I bring this story up. You can see that all of a sudden he divorced his wife, married her mother. All three of them were interviewed for the newspaper, and they said they were the happiest they could be. The husband had a new wife, the mother had a new husband, and the old wife got rid of her husband and was free and back out on the market. We tend to think of these times as being more conservative, but you would not believe how many stories I've discovered of people swapping spouses. And it's not as though a father died so the brother came in to save the farm and took care of the family. It was simply couples that knew each other said, hey, all of us are unhappy, let's switch partners and see what happens. It was far more common than you could ever imagine in times when we think of being truly conservative. Or what about traveling the state? Today it's pretty easy, pretty fun, but in the old days you had to watch out because some Minnesota towns were overrun by rats. That's exactly what they said was happening in Duluth. That tourists would go to Duluth and they would complain that they were being attacked by rats. They were everywhere in the city. Avoid Duluth at all costs. Thankfully, there are no rat attacks in Duluth recently, but I tend to like to think that the rats are simply regrouping and coming after tourists in Duluth a little bit later, but as of now, you are safe to travel to Duluth. Keep in mind, if you believe the Kensington Rune Stone, which they were said to have been discovered up in Alexandria area, it's a rune stone that if you believe that it's authentic and real, it seems to support the idea that explorers were here in America long before we thought they were. Others believe that the stone is nothing more than an elaborate hoax. But you can go to Alexandria, see it for yourself, and come to your own conclusion, whether it's a true artifact or simply a ruse by a farmer up in the area. It's easy to find where the museum is. It's right across the street from the giant Viking statue that they have in town in Alexandria. And speaking of giants, keep in mind that here in Minnesota, you claim to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan. But before you get too excited, so do the states of Wisconsin, Maine, Michigan, Vermont, Canada. Those crazy Californians believe that Paul is from there as well. But here's what we know about Paul Bunyan so far today, that the first oral tales of Paul Bunyan seem to have originated in the winter of 1885 and 1886 in a lumber camp just north of Tomahawk, Wisconsin, up in the Northwoods. But the first mention in print of Paul Bunyan came from a Michigan newspaper in 1893. Notice the spelling of Paul going out with his team. But the first time that Paul Bunyan is said to be doing something tall tale-ish, well, that came from a Minnesota newspaper in 1904. So perhaps all three states can lay claim to Paul Bunyan. But regardless of where Paul's from, in Minnesota, you have more roadside attractions of Paul and Babe, and better ones than anywhere else in the entire country. If many of you probably been to the Bemidji statues here, and if you do, pop inside to the historical museum, the Chamber of Commerce there. They have one of Paul Bunyan's old hunting guns there inside, along with his bobber and many others. Now, Paul was so good at hunting, it was said that he could shoot geese so high in the sky that by the time they hit the ground, the meat had already spoiled. Yeah. That's how high Paul could shoot up into the sky. Now, here in Minnesota, you have a lot to thank Paul and Babe for. In fact, if you like any of your amazing 10,000 lakes, you owe that to Paul and Babe, because it was their footprints and hoof prints that created all the lakes in Minnesota. When they walked through, they created these huge things that filled with rain, and that's how you got all your lakes. And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Chad, you're telling some tall tales. But I have proof, physical proof, because how else do you explain Lake Bemidji, which is in the exact footprint of Paul Bunyan as he made his way through your state? And of course, everyone knows Paul, and they know Babe, the blue ox, but a lot of people had no idea how these two actually met one another. Well, they met here in Minnesota years ago during the winter of the blue snow. What was happening is the weather was so horrible that year, people were cursing a blue streak so long that it turned all of your snow blue here in Minnesota. It was so cold.
How cold was it?
Thank you. It was so cold that your fish grew fur to stay warm. During the winter of the blue snow, you have the fur-bearing trout. That's when Paul found Babe. Babe had been in the snow so long, he turned blue from his white color, and the two had been traveling all over Minnesota and the Northwoods ever since. And they live on today, even though many believe Paul passed away. But I think that's the biggest yarn of them all. Many believe that Paul and Babe are still in the Northwoods looking for lumber camp after lumber camp. But believing in Babe the Blue Ox is a lot of fun. But sometimes these legends in Minnesota get a little scary. How many of you recognize this multi-Oscar winning movie? Some of the younger people here might. If you're not familiar with it, or the 10,000 sequels they've made of it, the premise is pretty simple. A serial killer happens to dabble in voodoo, But before he's shot by the police and passes on, he casts a spell to transfer his soul into a doll named Chucky, and it comes to life trying to hurt and harm everybody. But these stories only happen in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood or Janesville, Minnesota. For decades, people talked about the creepy doll that sat up in the window of this Janesville house. Some say it was put up there because a family murdered their child. Others say a young kid had a tragedy and his spirit is in there, or vice versa. There are numerous legends, but for decades, the owner never told why the doll was there. But for decades, people believed the place was cursed because they would go out of their way to avoid the house, because every time they walked by or rode their bike by or drove by, they claimed that the doll would come to life and watch them and move while they walked by. Eventually, it became a tourist destination. People would go there specifically to see the doll, to see if it would come to life. The dare was that if you went there and the doll came to life, you probably guessed it, you'd be cursed with bad luck until the day you died. I've collected hundreds and hundreds of these dares from around the world, and 99% of them are always mishap, misfortune, or death. It's never anything good. If you do this dare, you'll win the lottery or find true love. It's always terrible things. So do them at your own risk. But then the owner died. The doll went missing. People in Janesville were terrified. They thought they'd wake up and find it in bed with them at night. But don't worry, they found the doll, and they gave it a new home for a while. And it was a perfect home, because where else would you want to put a doll that could curse you? Where else should you put a doll that could take your life? Well, there's only one place for that, and that's at your town's local public library, which is exactly where they put it, overlooking downtown Janesville. The librarians told me they were amazed at how many people stopped in every day just to see the doll from out of town. But that's the problem, they were tourists. Local kids, they refused to go into the library because it was so scary. Eventually, they had to give the doll back to the man who bought the estate. He told me he keeps it at home. He wants to put it on display somewhere, but nobody in Janesville wants the doll, thinking that it's cursed and haunted. So now it's just sitting in the man's closet. Don't worry, you're not going to see any of your neighbors in this category. It's too long ago. But Minnesota has a unique history of weird people coming from your state. Keep in mind, here in Minnesota, you have nearly 12,000 lakes, even though you're known as the land of 10,000 lakes. And that's partly how you qualify what's a lake, what you use. Because if you use the same qualifications we do in Wisconsin, you'd have a lot more than 12,000 lakes. But you're known as the land of 10,000 lakes. And here in Minnesota, a lot of you probably have heard of the Me Too movement, but you good folks were way ahead of this movement, as evidenced by this story of a man that was attempted to harass his wife's friend. Must not have been a very good friend of his, but he kept trying to assault her, hug her, kiss at her. Finally, he was arrested. He was sent to a fine of $25 and court costs, which quite a sum of money in 1868, and he was not allowed within a certain range of his friend's wife. But I think he could have saved him and her a lot of trouble and just married her mother like that other guy did. Probably save himself fine and costs. But oftentimes things were different in the old days, and you might be thinking we haven't come very far in the last 150 years, but this next story does illustrate that we have come pretty far, whether you believe it or not. Because imagine reading stories like this in your newspaper of scalps from native people were being brought to the local hardware and the furniture store and put it on exhibit. The newspaper here went on to report that if you went to see the scalps, you should come back because more of them were arriving daily, and it would be a draw for you to come and see them. So again, maybe we have progressed a little bit more than we think we have. Keep in mind, here in Minnesota, during Prohibition, every big-name gangster of the day made their way through this very area. from John Dillinger in the middle to Babyface Nelson on your left to Creepy Carpus on your right. They loved Minnesota. They absolutely adored your state. Partly because of all the speakeasies you had here in your state. And during Prohibition, if you forgot, speakeasies were places where you could go and gamble and illegally drink. You could dance. They had ladies of the night that worked there. You had so many speakeasies in Minnesota that I think in your state, Prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law because they were everywhere, many of which still remain to this very day as legal places now. But speaking of Minnesota weird people, what about this gentleman? He was a farmer, and one day he got bored and he was spinning a little twine from one of the hay bales. Well, that twine ball got a little bit bigger. Eventually, it got to this size. You can see he didn't stop for many years, and then it weighed almost 9 tons and was 12 feet wide. They put it on display in Darwin, Minnesota, and eventually they gave it this nice enclosure to protect it from the elements. As you can see, it's the largest ball of twine by one man or one person. Believe it or not, there's a bigger ball of twine out there, but it was done in a community event, not done by one person. So you can stop by Darwin and see it on display. They even sell you a little starter kit on your own that you can start and make your own ball of twine. Psychic phenomena. I deal with a lot of psychics in my line of field of work, and they all tell me that we all have psychic ability, just some of us haven't done very well at adapting it. So we'll put that to the test. So I want you to think of the next slide. Whatever pops into your head, it could be absolutely anything or nothing in the universe. I put in a random image generator on the computer today, and well, this is what popped up. Anyone have that in their mind? Usually not. People still need to work. But in the old days, we were fascinated by psychics. In fact, oftentimes psychics would go on tours of the states, and they'd stop into your town at your local theater or opera house and put on a performance of whether it was some psychic display of mind reading or a seance and things of that nature. But sometimes these psychic events went a bit too far. And for that, we head right down south a little bit to the town of Winona. In the 1920s, Winona was known for its psychic vampire or death siren. It all began, the story, in 1922. But the story leading up to that was a few years back before that, because that's when this young woman, Frances Block, she died. And she was buried at St. Mary's Cemetery on the outskirts of Winona. Nothing weird there, but the fact was that as soon as she died, her brothers began dying one by one, year after year. Eventually, they all joined her in death. The family was down to their last remaining son. The family lived on the east end of Winona in this home in a very superstitious neighborhood. Neighbors told the father that when his last son got sick, that he could save them because what was happening is that his daughter was a psychic vampire coming out of the grave at night, inviting her siblings to join her in death. And it was often believed that the first child of a family that died would become a vampire. So the family was told that you can stop this. You can put an end to your family curse. You can save your last son. All the father had to do to stop this was to head out to the cemetery, dig his daughter up from her grave and cut off her head and bury it separately from the body. And guess what? He did it, or at least he tried. He hired a neighbor. They went out to the cemetery, dug up the daughter. But when they dug her up, they realized she was nothing more than a mere skeleton. They thought, she can't be a vampire. There's nothing to her. So they reburied her, went home. But the next day, his son took a turn for the worse. So they thought, maybe we screwed up. Maybe it wasn't the first daughter that died that's the vampire. Maybe it was our first son. So he went back out there. Now he was an experienced gravedigger. He dug up the son. Same thing, nothing but a skeleton. So he reburied him, and thought the case was closed. This was great. We solved the problem. Unfortunately, the next day, his son did indeed pass away. Now, the police found out about this. They went out to the cemetery, dug up the daughter to make sure her body wasn't desecrated. The only thing they found is a small white cross on her chin, which had been placed there at burial to prevent her from becoming a vampire. But here's the odd thing. This was 1922, and they did not charge the father with any crime. Because back then, there were no rules against it. You could dig up as many people as you wanted in Minnesota. As long as you didn't harm the bodies, you were free to do it. Don't try it today. The laws have changed quite a bit. But in fact, I've gone out there to her grave because many believe the vampire's still there. So I've been there both day and night, summer, winter, and I've never been attacked by the vampire. But then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me, just in case the vampire is still in Winona. I have in-laws in Winona, so I bring the hunting case with me anyway, so yeah, that's besides the point. Or what about this? An animal being cursed with psychic powers. You can see all these animals cremated because a man bought a horse that was called Hoodoo. And it was called Hoodoo because it had a track record of all sorts of bad things happening to it. Hoodoo was a form of voodoo, and it was often named as hoodoo. Someone hoodooed you. You had bad luck. And he bought it, the horse, very cheap, and a mysterious fire killed all of his other horses, leaving him with the belief that hoodoo really was a cursed horse, and that curses could go to animals as well. And the last category we're going to talk about is that of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Of course, skeptics today claim that the only reason we believe in UFOs is because of Hollywood. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day. That's why people believe in UFOs. But I'm going to show you stories in the next few here from long in Minnesota before Mulder and Scully were even out there investigating. Weird things of people seeing strangeness in the skies. And you often had stories like this. Airships in the sky. This one happened to be out of northern Minnesota, but check the date, because 1897 was a very important date, because from 1896 through 1898-ish, in America, thousands of people in hundreds of Midwestern cities saw these giant airships flying over their communities. You could follow the progress of these mysterious aerial things by following the newspapers, because every city would report them when they came into their community. Over the decades, the stories of UFOs in Minnesota continued on and on and on. But to get to one of my favorite Minnesota stories, we have to jump forward a few decades, all the way until 1965. Long Prairie, Minnesota. A young 19-year-old DJ was going into work one day when he passed a bend in the road here, when all of a sudden his car lost power, right as he saw what appeared to be a giant rocket ship in the middle of the road. A UFO. He said it was about 30 feet high. And because he thought none of his friends would believe him, he was going to run it over so he would have proof. But his car sputtered out, lost power, the radio, the lights, the engine died. So thinking as only a 19-year-old would, he said, I'll just get out of my car, go push it over, and then I'll have proof. So he walks to the front of his vehicle and he stops, frozen, because an opening appears on the bottom of the craft, and out of that opening came a bunch of little 6-inch oil can looking creatures. He said he couldn't see any cameras or eyes on them, but he felt like they knew he was watching them. They seemed to be doing some maintenance on the underbelly of the craft. He said it only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. But I love this story because the national media did not portray it this way. They did not say that he had seen little 6-inch oil can aliens. What the national media reported was that this Minnesota guy saw 6-inch beer can aliens walking around. Only in Minnesota would you have beer can aliens. So He watches them do some maintenance on the underbelly, and then they get back in the craft and fly off. All of a sudden his car's working again. He drives down to the local police station. Together they go back with him. They have no idea, but while he was watching it, people were calling in about a UFO being in the vicinity. So when they got to the police station, they believed him. They went back to the site, and unfortunately the craft was gone, but there in the middle of the road where the craft was a huge puddle of a weird oil-like substance. One of the officers said this was the weirdest thing he had ever encountered in his entire law enforcement career. And it must have been truly odd because they didn't take a photo of it. They didn't take a sample of it. They simply said, this is the weirdest thing ever, and left it there and went about their day. A few weeks later, the road was repaved. People I spoke with in the community were split. Some say that it was a government cover-up of the UFO sighting, and others told me the road simply needed to be repaired. Coincidence that there was a giant UFO sighting before the repavement. But I'll let you head to Long Prairie and determine whether there are any oil can or beer can aliens. But I still receive dozens of reports every year of strange things in the sky coming from your state. But as I'm running low on time this evening, here's what I hope you take from this program. That today in America, if you turn on your news on the television, if you look into the newspaper, if you listen to public radio, or God forbid you consult the internet, you'll probably say something like this: the world has gone crazy. Can you believe how crazy the world is today? And I agree with you. The world is completely bonkers today. But hopefully this program illustrated that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. And that they'll probably look back in 100 years when we're all gone and wonder what the heck we were doing, just like we were doing tonight with them. So I hope that's what you keep in mind, that the world has always been crazy, and hopefully it will always remain crazy. And if you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end in the library. Grab one of my books. The library has them for checkout if you like. Go on your own adventure of Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions, comments, or stories from any of you. Otherwise, you let me off the hook very easy this evening. Also, the library has surveys for this program tonight. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a lot of work into getting me here tonight, and they should be applauded for their efforts. So, yeah. Questions, comments, or stories from any of you? Otherwise, I will turn off the lights. We can get the surveys. It's very important to fill them out so that every program just doesn't go to the Twin Cities. So the legislature looks at it quite a bit. So, yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the spook lights in Joplin, Missouri? Have you heard of that?
Yes. So the
Then
spook
what's your
lights.
take on the whole thing?
Well, spook light. There's a very similar one up in the Northwoods by Michigan called the Paulding Light, which some of you have maybe been to. But a lot of them are very similar. They're by railroad tracks or by electrical lines, usually in a valley, and you see this light. But the closer you get to it, the less likely you are to see it. And in most versions, it's a man with a lantern, an old engineer, train conductor. But very interesting. Now, the one in Paulding, Michigan, they blame on headlights and taillights from a nearby road. Same with the Hornet Light or the Joplin Spook Light. But many of these stories predate automobiles. So some people think they're fairy fire or, marsh gas, swamp gas.
Swamp gas.
Yeah. So I've been to the Hornet one several times, and I'm perplexed. Yeah, very interesting. I love the legend of it. Yeah. You had something, ma'am? Well, people are...
Do you feel like, because you've been doing this for so many years, I mean, you've seen stuff, you've probably actually encountered stuff on your own while you were looking into things, have you yourself ever, do you feel like you've ever seen an actual ghost?
Short answer, no. Every place you hear me talk about or I write about, I actually visited for myself, checked it out, tried to sort fact from fiction, and every time I'm at places, nothing seems to happen. But you know, it's a bit naive because I'm only there a night or two or maybe three, and if nothing happens, where I hear people talking about it, that things are happening all the time. But sometimes I'll bring psychics with me, as I said, they'll claim to be pushed or pinched by these things. But for me, knock on wood, nothing yet. So I don't know if that's good or bad. But I firmly believe people are experiencing something because I've talked to too many thousands of rational, logical people that have had something odd happen to them that they can't explain. And many of them don't even believe in it. They'll say, now I don't believe in UFOs, but this is what I saw. Or, I obviously don't think Bigfoot's real, but I saw something weird. So yeah. Sir, you had something?
Yeah, a few years back I read a book on, weird sightings and all this, but most of them, they're talking to these kids that were from the late 60s, early 70s, and I go like, you got two guesses what may have been going on.
Sure.
So, I was just wondering, did you ever meet across people like, okay, you smoked a little too much and you dropped something you shouldn't have?
Great question. I always say, when you're dealing with the weird, what is too weird? Where do you draw that line? For me, what am I going to investigate and not? I'll give you a quick example. After one program I did about a decade ago in Iowa, a gentleman came up to me and a couple of my colleagues and said, you have to come to my farm right after this. I have a bunch of land and I have a lot of Bigfoot activity on the property. We said it was about 9 o'clock at night. We said, great, well, let's go. And he said, well, I don't know if you'll be able to see them because they're in a different dimension. I can see them, but you can't. And I thought, okay, I'll still go. Why not? It's worth the chance. And he said, well, they're probably busy. They like to have pool parties and cookouts. And he eventually didn't want us to come, but I was still going to go because where do you draw the line? Are vampire stories too weird? Or when you deal with the weird, nothing can be too weird. So, but yeah, we often look at whether people are under the influence of alcohol or some other substance. But sometimes, I went to college in Wisconsin, and we were known to have a adult beverage here and there. And no matter how many I had, I never thought I ran into a werewolf. So, so even if people tell me, like, yeah, we had a few drinks, but we were around the campfire, and, like I said, I think most of us have had maybe one cocktail too many at a time, and I don't remember ever thinking a vampire was coming after me because too many hams, Should have went with different brands.
Have you ever had any experiences that were just completely terrifying to you?
Oh, all the time, but usually just regular stuff. I was looking for a creature called the Tata Duende in Central America, and we were on the river, and it was infested with crocodiles. And we were terrified. It was midnight. All we had was a little canoe with a miner's lamp, and I was terrified, just because of all the crocs. Who cares about the Duende or the, La Llorona, who was thought to be this woman who would eat you on the side of the riverbanks. But so it was things like that, or the atmosphere of it. I was terrified. I had to run at night in Transylvania. I was staying at a farm in the country. I had to run like 3 miles through the woods to get some supplies at night. It was getting dark, and in the beginning I was walking and thinking, the moon's out, I'm in Transylvania, how awesome is this? And then your mind plays tricks on you where every branch breaking was Vlad the Impaler coming up to get me. So I ended up ran back as far as I could without my friends knowing I had run the whole way. But I wasn't technically thinking a vampire would get me. I wasn't scared of that, but for me that's half the fun, is getting scared. So, but yes, one more.
Have you ever like looked into Bigfoot?
Oh yes, and I love your shirt. I just noticed that, by the way. Yeah, there's tons of Bigfoot sightings here in Minnesota, and not only what you would think from the North Woods up by the all the heavily forested areas, but I have one in my Minnesota Creatures book out of Rochester, right in the downtown area. Someone saw it, and it made huge news. So yeah, we often think of them being in secluded areas, heavily forested areas, but sometimes you get reports of people right in their own backyard. So I will stick around if you want to ask me a question in private or tell me a story. Stop up to my table here, grab as many free postcards from me as you want. You can terrorize your enemies because that's one of the photos on the postcards. But again, thank you all for coming, and thank you for filling out the surveys, and enjoy the rest of your creepy night. Thank you.